Don't worry about me. I'm just looking at you all. Just carry on. It's a good vantage point. Now we're waiting for the live streaming to start. So when I get the thumbs up, we go. There we are. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce our speaker, Mark Oppenheimer. And I'm going to start by telling you something that's not on his CV at all, which is very short. And it's personal, and I hope when I do this I don't choke up, so I'm going to try and be macho about it. I have a schizophrenic, my wife and I have a schizophrenic daughter, and it's a long and complicated story, but she was declared an involuntary state patient, and they wanted to lock her in a state psychiatric institution, and we wanted to get her out. And I called Mark to ask, and I hope he doesn't mind me telling you this. I'm not looking at him in case he shakes his head or says no. I asked Mark if he could help us bring a legal action against the state to have our daughter freed, released from involuntary detention. And I said, you know, we don't have a deep pocket or a big budget. Can he tell me what it's likely to cost? And he said immediately, without hesitation, he would act pro bono. That meant a lot in the sense that he doesn't owe me anything. We, at that stage, were hardly even good friends. Now we're friends. I don't know if I could call him a good friend, but certainly that's the caliber of the man. He's a very proficient counsel in South Africa at the Johannesburg Bar. And he had no hesitation in saying he would like to fight that case. And it would have been a case fought on very complex legal principles. At the moment, the state, through, I forget the exact detail of the law, but it's something like 2 psychiatrists can basically certify somebody and lock them away for the rest of their lives. As it happened, our somewhat catatonic and very mentally ill daughter found a way to climb over the fence and run away, so we never needed to bring the case. And then they said the police were after us because we were harboring an involuntary state patient, which is a criminal offense, and they were coming to arrest us because we wouldn't tell them where she was. And I said, please do, please take me to jail. I want this to go to court. I want this to become a constitutional case. Poor old Mark had no idea what he would have been in for had it run the full course. But as it happens, after many threatening calls, the police didn't arrive, and so we haven't had to draw on him. But I just want you to know that's the person we're dealing with here, a man of extraordinary generosity and integrity, a very substantially brilliant lawyer, and somebody who is really worth listening to. The issue on which he's addressed us here before and on which he's done parliamentary presentations is the question of free speech. And on that, he's truly outstanding. If you get a chance to hear him on the subject, make sure you don't miss it. And, or for that matter, go onto our website and look at the podcast of the talk he gave in this very room on that subject. As I said, he's an advocate at the Johannesburg Bar. He's represented newspapers that were threatened with defamation suits. That, for me, is an interesting philosophical question ever since my own legal studies. I've never really been decided where I stand on the question of defamation. Should it really be an actionable offense, or should it be a matter of free speech? It's, to me, an interesting and difficult philosophical question. And he's fought for individuals who were wrongfully arrested by police. Now, by the way, I get wrongfully arrested regularly because I refuse to stop at roadblocks. I ask them for their warrants. They say they want my driver's license. I say, no, I want your warrant. And they say, no, go. And I say, no, I'm stopping because you're running an illegal. And they always arrest me. They arrest me, and then I say, good, now please charge me. And they never do. And of course, I have in the back of my mind that I will have this very substantial counsel who pro bono will represent me for defying roadblocks. And I'm just astonished that South Africans accept roadblocks, that innocent people going about, like in the old pass laws, get stopped and and you get searched and you get told to present your driver's license, which is yours. And it just amazes me that I think I'm from the wrong planet. I'm the only person who thinks it's wrong and the only person who demands of them. And they tell me to go and I say no. Until they arrest me, I demand to see their warrant for the roadblock. Depending on whether it's technical, whether it's the Police Act or the Traffic Act, different rules apply, which he would have to represent me on in my challenge. So he represents sort of crazy people like me. He's represented owners who have been mistreated by municipalities. He's done presentations in Parliament on the question of free speech and laws and legislation threatening free speech. I think that's perhaps one of his great areas of interest and speciality. He's appeared on the Renegade Report, ANN7, which he admits to, CNBC, Africa and others. He's written articles on non-racial affirmative action, property rights, and threats to free speech in Politics Web, Business Day, City Press. And it's my pleasure to hand you, so to speak, Mark Oppenheimer, who is, for reasons I've given, someone who means a lot to me personally. Mark, over to you.
Well, Leon, thank you so much for such a marvelous introduction. Speaking of putting in your hard work and getting paid nothing like pro bono lawyers, we can talk about the state expropriating your land. So, to my mind, expropriation without compensation is the greatest threat that we face as a nation at the moment. If we implement a policy which leads to this on a wide-scale basis, it'll destroy our economy, it'll imperil jobs, and lead us to the rack and ruin that we see in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. And that's why my presence today is about how to stop it. Okay. But before we learn how to stop it, I think we need to cure ourselves of some myths. So there are a number of myths that are prevalent about land reform, and I think I'm going to try and take you through a few of those. And it's important that we fight back against these myths with the truth. So myth number one is that the land has not been given back to its rightful owners. Now, as a lawyer who cares deeply about justice, I'm going to say that if your land was taken from you unjustly, you are deserving of compensation. So if you owned land and it was taken from you by the apartheid state unlawfully or unfairly, you are deserving of compensation. Now, there's two different ways that compensation can happen. The one is that the original land is given back to you, and the other is that you're awarded financial compensation. Now, what we've got to recognize is that this has been an ongoing process and has been from 1995 to 2014, and that during this time, 1.8 million individuals have received their land back or received money. So I'll give you a little bit of a breakdown of the stats. So this shows you by province exactly how much land was restored, and it shows you on a national level as well. You can see the number of cases that were run in the Land Claims Court. People were given an opportunity to present their case to say, this is the land that I used to have, this is how it was taken from me, and I want compensation. And as I say, 1.8 million individuals have received that. If we look at the number of cases that were dealt with, so we had 79,000 cases that were brought. Often it's brought on behalf of a community. So we can see that there are 370,000 households. And we can see that of those almost 80,000 cases that were brought, 77,000 of them have been resolved. So this is 95% of cases up to 2014 have been resolved. Now, why have I stopped at 2014? It's because there was basically a period of time for people to bring land claims, which was capped at 2014. There was then a move to extend the land claims process. The Constitutional Court found that this extension was procedurally irregular. They didn't have the proper consultations, and so what we've had is a number of claims that have been sitting in abeyance that cannot be dealt with because there is no governing legislation to deal with them. So what we have are this small number of claims, I think it's roughly a few thousand, that need to be resolved under the old dispensation, and then a move could be made at some point to use the same process that's been done, which is the judicial process. So what's the second myth? Well, that myth is that there is this hunger for land, that the people just want the land right now, right? Now, there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, as I mentioned, when you've had the compensation process, most people didn't actually ask for their land back. Okay? In some cases, that land is sacred land. It's where your ancestors are buried, or it has a particular symbolic impetus for you, or you really want that land. But that's only 8% of cases. In 92% of cases, people said, I'd rather have the money, please. Now, there's good reason why people choose the money. Money represents freedom. Firstly, with the money, you can go and buy the piece of land that you want, not the piece of land that you would have been allocated in the rural areas. You know, if you're a modern person, having a stretch of land in the middle of the Northern Cape isn't going to be very useful for you. You might want to use that money to start a business, to pay off your debts, you know, to invest in the market. So wise people choose money. They don't ask for land. The IRR has done some polling on this, and they asked South Africans, what are the burning issues for you? You can see at the top there, okay, 39.7% of people say unemployment. So almost 40% say unemployment is the issue. Then a third say service delivery, water, lights, roads. You can keep going down, and right at the bottom, land distribution at 0.6%. Okay. Almost no one sees this as a big issue. There is no genuine hunger for land. What we have are a small minority of people that are incredibly vocal. As politicians, you have to hand it to them that they've managed to turn this non-issue into something that energizes people. And part of that is because there is this symbolic thing in land. As I mentioned earlier, you know, for some people, that particular piece of land is sacred. You know, my ancestors are buried there. If you think about what the Nazis did, they would refer to our land, our German land that was taken from us. You know, we need to unite together to get our land back. It's a very kind of like blood and soil kind of thing to say. And the EFF do an incredible job of pushing this issue. You have Black First, Land First, whose slogan is land or death. Okay? But the average South African, not interested. Myth number 3 is that anyone can be a farmer. It's just like the vegetable garden that you have in, you know, back home. It's very easy. Anyone can do it. Except it's not. It's a highly technical thing. I mean, if someone had to expropriate my legal practice and then walk into it, what would they have? They would have nothing, because they don't have my skills. They don't have the years that I've put into learning about the law and its intricacies. With farmers, it's generational. If you think about people that run wine farms, it's hundreds of years of passing down arcane knowledge. It's using highly specialized equipment. And that's just the technical stuff involved in producing your produce. There's all the business stuff involved as well, you know, supplier relations, you know, dealing with fluctuating weather conditions. So it's not a simple thing that anyone can just be a farmer, and we find this is exactly what happens in practice. So government has spent 1.4 billion rand buying farms. Okay, this is just a particular instance in the Eastern Cape. And they said, we'll buy 264 farms and we'll redistribute them. So they were paying compensation in these cases, as they ought to have. And what do we find? Only 26 of those farms still function. So a 90% failure rate. And it's not surprising, because you're dealing with a very technical endeavor. Very well illustrated by the cartoonist Germ here. You know, you can see exactly the situation where it's, here's just a few things to, you know, get you going so you can learn a bit about my arcane field. And very quickly you realize, can I have the money, please? You know? So, myth number 4. This is one peddled by our President Ramaphosa. He said, don't worry, EWC won't hurt the economy. And I'm of the view that this is akin to saying that a vow of celibacy won't affect your sex life. Unfortunately, the two are intricately connected. If you remove property rights, you are sentencing the nation to failure. And what is amazing about South Africa, of course, is the sense of South African exceptionalism. You know, we have an incredible story to tell. You know, we were a country on the brink of civil war, and we managed to negotiate our way out of that, and we generally have a peaceful society. And partly because of that, we say, well, we can do things other nations have tried and failed, and we'll get it right. So let's try expropriation without compensation, while forgetting that it's been tried in Zimbabwe, and it's been tried in Venezuela. If we look at what's happened in Zim, it's not just those farmers that have been hard done by. They have a 90% unemployment rate in Zimbabwe. You know, a lot of Zimbabweans live in South Africa. They're driven into exile because of how bad that decision was for their economy. In Venezuela, what you have at the moment, every time I give a talk like this, I have to update the figure. So to give you an idea, the last time I was on TV talking about this, I said the inflation rate was 876,000%. Okay? Looked a few days ago, it's 1.3 million %. Okay? They're going to beat Zim. Okay? That's an incredible record to try and beat. You have mass starvation. You have millions of people fleeing Venezuela. Now, Venezuela was the richest country in South America. They have the world's biggest supply of oil in the world. So it's incredible to have this gift, this natural gift that you have, and you throw it down the toilet because of a terrible economic policy. Within 20 years of socialism, they've managed to destroy a nation. But don't worry, South Africa is different. When we do it, it won't damage the economy. Just a little reminder of what that looks like. This is a $100 trillion note. Okay. We can look forward to seeing this in rands if we implement expropriation without compensation. And we can buy this group of tomatoes with these Venezuelan bolivars, as you can see, stacked up. That's how many tomatoes you get. This picture is a few months old, so I can't guarantee that you'll get that many tomatoes anymore. Myth number 5 is that the only way that we can have justice, the only way that we can have true land reform is without paying compensation, because paying compensation is unaffordable. It's an outright lie. It's an outright lie because if we look at how much money is dedicated towards land reform at the moment, it's 0.3%. It is an absolute rounding error. For an issue that has been consuming our presses for over a year now, okay, that this is the issue of the nation, the government says, we'll allocate 0.3% of the budget to deal with it. If it really is the issue which they think it is, well, you can allocate more money. We're talking about such a tiny proportion of our budget. So there's something very disingenuous in that. Also, once you start interfering with property rights, well, where does the budget come from? It comes from taxes. Okay? So you're going to destroy the economy, which means that you're going to have a lot less revenue available for all the other schemes that government has in mind, right? I mean, this is one among many socialist or communist practices the government is keen on, like NHI, like free education. Those things cannot be funded if you scare off your taxpayers, who will leave in droves because they'll have to abandon their property once it's seized by the state. There's an amazing graph that's been going around which shows you inequality in South Africa. And there's something quite sobering about it. So what they ask you to do is to guess what percentile you're in terms of earnings in the country, and then it shows you where you actually sit. Turns out that if you earn more than 11,000 Rand per month, you're in the top 5%. Okay. If you earn more than 48,000 Rand a month, you're in the top 1%. Okay. Now, the idea of this graph is to make you feel immense guilt at the fact that you earn this money and to say, this rarefied elite. Here's the thing. It just shows you how fragile South Africa really is. If that 1% says, you know what, we're sick of being abused by the state, we don't want our property confiscated, we're going off to many of the other places that we have citizenship rights to, we're going to go to Australia or the UK or America or Israel or wherever else, people are fond of saying, go back to Europe, fine, we'll leave. If you leave, what do you think is going to happen to the tax base? That 1% contributes an enormous amount to the rest of the country. Those people are saints. Those people are paying for roads, for education, for hospitals. You don't want to see them leave. Final myth is that the Constitution impedes land reform, and this is why the move to try and change the Constitution, to say that this document is a traitorous document. South African people were sold out through negotiations with the National Party, and we have to change the Constitution or else we can never have justice, we can never have land reform. And I'm going to make it clear, as I said in the beginning, land reform is important. If your land was taken from you, you are deserving of compensation, and it's important that the state caters for that. You might think as well that people were deprived of access to land because of apartheid, not just that land was taken from them, but they were deprived of opportunities. And that's why you want other kinds of redistributive measures, that you want the state to be able to buy land so people can be housed, that RDP housing plays an important role. Now, does the Constitution impede this? Well, not at all. In fact, what the Constitution is this incredible roadmap for how you deal with these different conflicting issues, how you deal with people that own property, how you deal with the landless, and try and find some sort of just outcome. So this is the relevant section of Section 25 of our Constitution, being the property clause section. And this deals with how compensation is dealt with. It says, the amount of compensation and the time and manner of payment must be just and equitable, reflecting an equitable balance between the public interest and the interest of those affected, having regard to all relevant circumstances, including the current use of the property, the history of the acquisition and use of the property, the market value of the property, the extent of direct state investment and subsidy in the acquisition and beneficial capital improvement of the property, and the purpose of the expropriation. All right, so a lot of stuff to listen to. I'm going to try and unpack it for you and make it simple. First things first. The Constitution provides for expropriation. Okay. Now, expropriation is a bit of a terrifying word, especially when accompanied without compensation. But all states expropriate. They have to. So if we think about the Gautrain project, in order to build that system, you have to go through private land. So what do? You approach owners and say, I'd like to buy your land. If they refuse, you then expropriate and you pay them according to this method. The first thing that our courts say that you do is you go, what's the market value of the land? Okay, and then we can adjust up or down based on the other factors. So, for example, we can say, well, what's the historical acquisition? How did you acquire this land? If, as people are fond of saying, that the land was acquired at the barrel of a gun, and I mean that genuinely, not in the metaphorical sense. In other words, the person who owns this land stole it. They are direct thieves. Okay, this is going to give you a very good reason to say you get paid nothing. This is what the Germans have done. So Nazis who are in possession of stolen items were not paid compensation when they were handed back to beneficiaries. Okay? And justly so. They said, you're a thief. Why should you get an entitlement? However, if you're a good faith possessor in title, 4 generations down the line, maybe you have some small portion of this property which was once stolen, that you played no role in the theft, well, then we have very good reasons to pay you compensation because you're innocent. So the other thing we can look at is to say, well, hold on a sec, did you get any state subsidy to acquire this land or to develop this land? Well, if so, we can set it off. So we can say, you have this farm, but the government gave you a couple of million rand so that you could start this farm. And it's only worth a couple of million rand. So we can set each other off. And so you could have an instance where zero compensation is payable. But the general principle is going to be that once you've assessed the factors, it's going to be just and equitable in most circumstances to pay compensation. So, given that we have this threat, given that we have an ANC government in alliance with the EFF that are hell-bent on changing our constitution, that want to alter the Bill of Rights for the first time in South Africa's history. So our constitution has been amended 17 times. And if you go and look at those amendments, none of them are to the Bill of Rights, and they're all to rather technical things. So provincial boundaries, whether we have floor crossing or not. Nothing as sacred as our Bill of Rights. So we're heading into new territory here. The idea that there's this full frontal attack to the most sacred portion of our most sacred document, the Constitution. And it's times like this when we need to rely on inspiration from those that have come before us. Winston Churchill says, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I can say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against the monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. Now, Churchill sets out a war to be waged on land, sea, and air. I'm going to tell you about a different kind of war. First is in the press. We have an ill-informed, very left-leaning press, many of whom have said, expropriation or compensation is a wonderful idea, we need to do this, it's required to rectify the injustice of the past, and let's just get on with it. We have a very small number of voices that have pointed out why the policy is a terrible policy, not just for wealthy people sitting in this room, but for the poorest of the poor. It's important that people write, that they express their views and they deal with some of the information that I've given you today. So I wrote an article for the Sunday Times called 6 Myths About Land Reform, where I've iterated some of what I've told you today. It's important that you're persuasive, that you're pithy, that you're able to express these ideas in a manner that is understandable, that you support those journalists that do write on it, And unfortunately, not all of those journalists are in the mainstream press. So we do have wonderful people like Ramon and Jonathan at the Renegade Report, who've dedicated hours and hours of their podcast to talk about this important issue. They've had on excellent people like Franz Grenier, like Ernst Rutz, talking about the dangers of expropriation without compensation. So if you don't have the platform of a newspaper, you can be innovative like Martin did, and you can start your own newspaper. The Rational Standard, it's an unbelievable achievement what Martin has done. A couple of guys in their early 20s, ignited by the Fees Must Fall movement to say, hold on a second, we're seeing our campuses alight, this isn't okay, have managed to corral in so many sensible voices, and they've done an excellent job on this issue as well. So there are people out there who are dedicating their time for free, like Martin, like the Renegade Report guys, like someone like Gareth Cliff at Cliff Central who hosts the Renegade Report. They've done an important job of expressing these ideas. So if you have the ability to write. If you have the ability to do other kinds of things like appearing on TV or appearing on radio, do it. Express the ideas in the press. Next, fight's got to be at the polls. Now, these are the parties that oppose expropriation without compensation. Okay. Not all of them are doing it as loudly as they could, but we do know that when Parliament took a vote to say we are going to amend the Constitution, okay, these are the parties that voted against it. At the moment, the way that vote goes is it was 69.6% of parliamentarians. Okay, so basically you have an alliance with ANC, the EFF, I think Achanga in there, and the AIC. If any of you thought that Achang and Mampela were going to do wonderful liberal things, well, you were wrong. So these are the guys that on this issue have really played an important role. And I have to say, while the DA has been a lot quieter than they could have been on this issue, really they've sort of cowered in the corner. The other parties have done a much better job in some ways. So someone like Monsieur Lekota stood in front of his former colleagues in the ANC and he said, when the president says that we are going to take back the land for our people, he said, who are our people exactly? I thought South Africa was a land for all who live in it. That's what it says in our constitution. That's what it says in the Freedom Charter. Who is this us and them? And when he said that, he was heckled and abused. And he stood and he's kept up this promise to say our constitution is sacred. I will not allow property rights to be taken away. Deserving of your vote. The ACDP have also played an important role. As much as I disagree with them on some of their religious values, they've played an important role on this committee. They have valiantly fought for property rights protections, as have the Vryheidsfront and the IFP as well. So it's important to acknowledge that some parties have played a role. And given that I've told you how narrow that difference is, that 69.6%, why that number matters, as I'm going to show you, the Constitution says if you want to make a change to Chapter 2 of the Constitution, you need 2/3. Now, in the next election, if some of these parties eat into that vote, by 4%, they don't have enough votes to pass through the constitutional amendment. So as much as you might have to hold your nose to vote for some of these guys, at least they're doing something on this core issue. So that's the fight at the polls. The next fight is in the courts. This is if we're faced with a law which aims to change our constitution. We have to then turn to the highest court in the land, the Constitutional Court. Now, we can have an idea of what challenge we're facing us by looking at the expropriation bill. But I will say this first of all, which is that we have no language at the moment as to what the plan is to change the constitutional text. So we have a promise of what they intend on doing, but there is no bill before us. So we're sitting in limbo before the elections. But the expropriation bill may give us some hints. So this new bill, which is not a law, acts or laws, bills or sort of proposals, sets out when you could expropriate without paying compensation. Now it says it may be just and equitable for nil compensation to be paid where land is expropriated in the public interest in regard to these circumstances, but not limited to. In other words, there could be additional ones. All right. First one is where the land is occupied or used by a labour tenant. So technical definition, it's often going to be people that are farm labourers on land. There's an immediate unforeseen consequence here, which is that if you're a farmer who's got labour tenants who've been on your land for generations, okay, who have some level of security of tenure, comfort of a job, but you don't want to lose that land and be paid nothing, you have every reason in the world to remove them from your land now before this happens. So something like this with good intentions, which is we're going to expropriate the land without compensation, please note it doesn't say to give it to the labourers. In all likelihood it'll just be seized by the state, so that those people can be serfs to the state. So if you're a farmer right now, you have every reason in the world to just bring in the red ants, kick those people off your land, have a fight about whether your eviction was unlawful, but ensure that your land is now protected from expropriation without compensation. Second one, where the land is held for purely speculative purposes. I'm going to show you something quickly. So some of you may recognize this as a spot of land in Midrand. This is Waterfall Estate. Okay. Now you can see it's been heavily developed, but this is a very recent thing. So this land was vacant for more than 70 years. It was owned by the Mia family. Massive tract of land worth billions. Now, they didn't develop it. Why not? Because they hoped it would be worth some money someday, and they decided to see what would develop. So you had a growing Pretoria and a growing Joburg, and suddenly Midrand becomes desirable. So they speculated, and if this piece of legislation was in force, they would have had that land seized by the state, and they would have been paid nothing. And that just seems incredibly unjust to me. The other ones are less worrisome. So where the land is owned by a state-owned corporation or other state-owned entity. Great. Eskom owns a whole bunch of stuff and the state wants to take it and redistribute it, go for it. Where the land has been abandoned. Our common law tradition says land that's abandoned has no, there's no owner behind the thing. Okay, so there's no one being deprived of a right. And the last one, where the market value of the land is equivalent to or less than the present value of direct state investment or subsidy in the acquisition and capitalization of the land. Again, we gave you $1 million so you could buy this land, it's worth $1 million, so we're taking it, we're just going to do a set-off. That doesn't seem like a problem to me. But bear this in mind, this purely speculative purposes, this is dangerous, because as you'll see, this all refers to land, but the principle is a difficult one. So some of you are going to be sitting with some excess money in your bank accounts. What's it doing there? It's sitting, speculating, wondering where it should go. Maybe I'll buy some property, maybe I'll put it overseas, maybe I'll buy a car, maybe I'll invest in the market. I don't know, I'm speculating. So there's nothing wrong with speculating. It provides people an opportunity to assess their risks, to work out where they're going to make the most profit. Why did you buy your house? Part of it was because you thought, well, I hope it's worth some more money when I die, or when I want to move. You were speculating. Nothing sinister about speculation. All right. So what has this Constitutional Review Committee decided? Well, after a very long process. So what they did was they did a roadshow around the country, which the EFF, again, I have to hand it to these guys, very good at playing politics. They made an enormous effort to bus in members who would be there, who would be loud and vocal and would say, we want the land back, land or death. And so they arrived at these meetings and they kicked up a fuss. You never really had any deliberation because people were capped at a few minutes. But they made sure their members were there and they created this impression, this circus of there's a hunger for land. So they did the roadshow, which as I say is largely a theatrical sham. And then they had to consider some actual deliberations, which they did in Parliament. And they received an enormous number of submissions, hundreds of thousands of submissions. And what's amazing about these submissions is that 65% of those submissions say, don't do it. Don't change the Constitution. And they go into a range of detailed reasons why. I presented a submission on behalf of the Johannesburg Attorneys Association. It's available online. You can watch a number of the submissions on YouTube. And you can see why it's such a bad idea and how many intelligent people think it's such a bad idea. Nevertheless, the Constitutional Review Committee said, we're going to do it. So here's the language that's important. They say, Section 25 of the Constitution must be amended to make explicit that which is implicit in the Constitution with regards to expropriation of land without compensation as a legitimate option for land reform, so as to address the historic wrongs caused by the arbitrary dispossession of land, and in so doing ensure equitable access to land and further empower the majority of South Africans to be productive participants in ownership, food security and agricultural reform programs. Next, that Parliament must urgently establish a mechanism to effect the necessary amendments to the relevant part of Section 25 of the Constitution and this must all be done before the next election. Now, I think some of them have conceded that they don't have the time, that they can't ram this through. You'll see that what they have to do is, this doesn't tell you what changes they want to make. It says, well, we've got to get another committee to decide what those changes are going to be. So you'll have the Justice Committee, which will then deliberate on some language. There's an argument that that language is limited in scope in a couple of ways. Firstly, Section 25 deals with property. Land is a subclass of property, which means they cannot affect any of the rights that you have regarding property. They can only affect the subclass being land. Okay. The next is they say to make explicit that which is implicit. Vague. What does this mean? Well, on the one hand, it could mean nothing. In other words, you can only do that which is already there. We can only explicate those things that are implicit in the text. Now, as I've said, and it's a sort of popular view among some academics, that the Constitution already allows for expropriation of the compensation. It does, in some narrow cases. So in an instance where your property has no market value, or where the state's given you a loan, or where you stole the land, in those cases, there's no compensation required. But you've got the big 100 million rand wine farm, okay, which you didn't steal, the state gave you no money to set up, it was made from your own hard efforts. Well, under the current Constitution, they've got to pay you. And so one of the big challenges will be, in other words, if that legislation amending the Constitution goes beyond any of the meaning that we have in our current Constitution, that's an immediate room for attack. To say, hold on a second, this committee only gave Parliament a very narrow mandate, and Parliament has extended beyond that. Okay, so I've mentioned to you that there are these different thresholds for changing the Constitution. First is if you want to change Section 1 of our Constitution, you need 75%. So this is seen as the fundamental portion of the Constitution. And Martin has really written phenomenally well on this topic. I'm going to touch on it briefly, but it's well worth reading some of Martin's work on how the rule of law can play a role in protecting our Constitution. The second is that you need 2/3 to change the Bill of Rights. So let's have a quick look at Section 1. These are these foundational values for South Africa. So human dignity, achievement of equality, advancement of rights and freedoms, non-racialism and non-sexism. So on that non-racialism front, this idea that we can seize land owned by people of a particular race and give it to people of another race, well, Section 1 says, not on your life. This is a country founded on the value of non-racialism. We've been down that path before. We've imposed heavy racialized legislation to ensure that some people could not be owners, that they could not live in certain areas. And that's why our constitutional forefathers said, lest we forget, that's not happening. And so if they want to do anything on that basis, they would have to change that non-racialism clause. Okay, this is the bit that Mark's written very well about, which is supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. Here the idea is that the rule of law is not just about application of the law, it is about certain substantive values, and that one of those values is the right to private property. That it's embedded in it. People think of life, liberty and property as being embedded in the rule of law, and so the argument is that if you intrude on property rights, you're really intruding on the rule of law, and you cannot do that unless you can get 75% of parliamentarians to agree to it. Okay. There's another kind of challenge that can be done. Now, it's novel because, as I say, we've never interfered in the Bill of Rights before. This is Section 36 of our Constitution, okay? And really what it is it governs when the state can limit any of the rights in the Bill of Rights. It says they can only be limited in terms of a law of general application, okay? Which means, in other words, you can't just have some dignitary saying, I'm doing it, okay? You have to pass a statute, okay? To the extent the limitation is reasonable and justifiable in an open and democratic society. Now, that phrase, open and democratic society, what our courts have done before is to say, well, what do other democratic societies do? We're trying to work out what is reasonable. We know that countries around the world have expropriation regimes, and that international law deals with what you need to do when you expropriate. And the test in international law is that you pay prompt and adequate compensation. Okay. It's definitely not zero. Prompt and adequate is how we cash out just and equitable in our Constitution. So it's democratic societies based on human dignity, equality and freedom, and then you take into account these other factors. So first of all, you look at the nature of the right. You're dealing with a fundamental right, the right to property. Okay. Now, what's the importance of the purpose of the limitation? Well, presumably it's land reform. It's to provide people with more access to houses. What's the extent of that limitation? It is dramatic because you are confiscating land that is owned by someone and you are paying them nothing. You are stealing from them. It is as dramatic a limitation as you could have. Now, is there a limitation? Is there a relationship between the limitation and its purpose? Well, as I've said, if what you're trying to do is assist the vulnerable, well, you're going to do the exact opposite because you're going to wreck the economy. You're going to have huge instability. So all those people that you want to try and assist are not going to be assisted. They're going to be destroyed. Are there less restrictive means to achieve the purpose? Yes, we've been doing them. We have compensated 1.8 million individuals for land that was taken from them. We can continue to have a just, fair judicial process to determine that. We can allocate more than 0.3% of the budget. So the use of this section is to say, look, even if Parliament gets the numbers, let's say they continue, voters don't turn out, the ANC and the EFF get their higher threshold, they're sitting at 69% together, and they say, we're doing it, we're passing this bill. Well, this is the protection in the Constitution. This is the force field that says you can only do that, you can only limit the right in the Bill of Rights if you meet these other tests. And so I think this is going to play an enormous role in litigation that goes forward. When the challenges come, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about those that are going to be bringing these challenges. These are the organizations that have stood up, that have said, this is a fight worth fighting. We're going to put our intellectual resources, our financial resources into writing about this, into engaging in litigation. They have played an enormous role. So we've got the Helen Suzman Foundation, AfriForum, Sakelicha, which had an incredible conference on this topic. They managed to get all of the big stakeholders together, all of the opposition parties that at least are united on this question to protect our Constitution. They got them together. They got a number of civil society organizations together. They've produced excellent press statements. They are playing an enormous role in fighting this fight. Institute for Race Relations has made this a big issue. They are producing wonderful media content. You've got someone like Sikhle Nkobesi touring the country, telling people why expropriation without compensation is not going to help anyone. It's going to be bad for the poor, be bad for the nation. As I mentioned, the Johannesburg Attorney Association has played quite an important role in saying that the Constitution matters, the rule of law matters, and we're going to protect it. And finally, of course, the Free Market Foundation, which has held its own conferences, has produced a number of articles on the topic, and has brought all of you here together today. So, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer as many questions as you like.
Did you handle the questions?
Yes.
And when the time is up, I guess, I'll sing.
Sure. Yes, first, go for it.
Congratulations on an excellent presentation. It's put it into such definitive thing that I think we can all take away and work on. That's first of all. I was here at the presentation that was by Alex on EWC, but I believe it should be repeated here. I'm a Buccleuch resident and a very powerful ANC politician. Started on the public WhatsApp site and asked for my address. And he asked, people were asking why you want it. He said, because Jim's address is going to be top of the expropriation list for Buccleuch. And he said, if he resists, he will personally pepper spray me, put me in handcuffs, and throw me into jail. Now, my perception of that is that's a general thought that's happening within the ANC party. And that's why it's so important that everybody takes this away and works on it and gives it to everybody else. And the question I've got is, will you give your presentation out?
Yes, without a doubt. So as I say, the purpose of doing what I'm doing today is to get these ideas out into the world. It's not just those of you in this room, it's those of you watching on the live stream on Facebook, those of you that are going to watch later on YouTube. I'm happy to make this presentation available to anyone that wants it. There are longer, more substantive documents. There's articles, there's the submissions to Parliament. All of it is freely available. It's one of the things I'm happy to do pro bono for you. Yes?
Mark, thanks for your presentation. I believe that Section 4 holds a lot of prospect for the rule of law because Dicey, who was one of the original authors of the rule of law, mentioned specifically property as being protected as part of the concept of the rule of law. So I think a court of law would think twice before saying it's not. In other words, by international convention and the writers on the rule of law. The second issue which you didn't mention is international treaties. South Africa is a member of various international treaties, including the United Nations Human Rights, which specifically again talks about property rights. So there's a lot of scope in that to argue the international treaty side.
There is. So specifically on international law, we did...
Not only the UNO one, there are quite a lot of others too.
Yes. The Joburg Attorney Association did multiple submissions. So we wrote a short one which is sort of pretty similar to what I've told you about tonight, then presented in person, and I spoke to the parliamentarians quite a bit about international law and this problem of South Africa being rendered a pariah state if they act out of accordance with international law. And on that basis they invited us to write something longer and more substantive. So there's about a 30-page submission on the international law implications, having a look at what treaties you signed up to, what implications it has. Our Constitution specifically recognizes international law as well. It says that you must consider it when interpreting the Constitution. So, yeah, that's an important thing.
Good evening. What I'm wondering, when we looked at the slide about the expropriation bill, they specifically mentioned, I can't remember the exact wording, but equitable land distribution reform. Not sure what the exact wording is, but what do they mean by both equitable and land? And will it simply stay at land, or will it expand, as I've talked to some of the people here tonight, or will it expand from land to property in general? Just think, what are your thoughts on that?
So, look, the original move to change the Constitution, when the Constitution Review Committee was tasked with touring the country and bringing in written submissions, they narrowed it. So they originally said expropriation of land without compensation. Now, I don't know if it was because they were clumsy, but I certainly seized on it and made a big point of it in my presentation to say you cannot do anything beyond land because of the question that you have put before yourselves. You've asked the public to comment on this narrow question, not property. Now, the problem, of course, is, in other words, so I say they can't affect other property rights, but they do certainly set a very dangerous precedent, which is that if you're willing to affect something like land, which is so fundamental, well, what's to stop them, attacking your shares, or your private bank account, or your car, or whatever else it is, your intellectual property. There's another problem as well, which is what accedes to your land. So if your house is built on it and cannot be moved, and they expropriate the land, can they say, well, the land includes your house? Or do they say, well, we're taking the land for free, but we'll pay you for the building? That'll be something that will be decided by the courts. Equitable, as you point out, it's a kind of weasel word. It depends. It's sort of what's fair in the circumstances. Typically, lawyers talk about the difference between courts of justice and courts of equity. Courts of equity, tend to be, well, I kind of feel like, yeah.
It's just a vague, but just the final thing, because that I forgot to mention. Who will be getting the land once it's been taken? Yeah. Will it just lay in the sorry about this? Will it just be in the hands of the government, or will they just give it to whoever asks? Who will be getting the land at the end of the day?
So, yeah, it's an important question. We can have a look at the state's behavior in the past, which is that the state doesn't like poor people owning property. So Leon has really led the way in this with the Kailan project, saying that people that have been living on land for a very long period of time but have no title to that land are being treated like serfs, and they should be given title to that land. We know that what the state likes to do is to act as custodian to say that, we as your Heavenly Father will take the land for us and we'll bestow it upon you as we deem fit, basically to our cadres, to those that vote for us. Karen Morton produced an article a couple of days ago talking about what's happened in some recent land development projects. There are 43 officials who are facing criminal charges because they've been involved in fraudulent schemes. So even when you've got a compensation system in place, you obviously have a bunch of hungry officials who are going to defraud it. Can you imagine how dangerous it is going to be when you can settle your petty grievances by saying, well, as the state, we're going to take that and pay you nothing for it and hand it to our mates. You just open yourselves up to all sorts of abuses. David.
Thanks, Mark. I was wondering, could you go back to the slide with section 12.3? And it's to the gentleman's point there, and I think it's just worth reviewing it because there's a phrase there that says, so it lists those 5 criteria, that it says including but not limited to.
Yes.
So, I mean, surely that leaves open quite a lot of uncertainty, right? I mean, if they wanted to include other conditions, then surely they should have just included that in the legislation. I mean, do you think that that is potentially, something that could be exploited by would-be expropriators who...
David, you don't have enough faith in the state. We can trust the administrators who will look at this and apply their minds fairly. How dare you imply they wouldn't? Yeah, of course. I mean, this is an exact example of the difference between arbitrary power and the rule of law. Okay. The rule of law means you need to enumerate exactly what your legal powers are. You can tell me I can do A, B, C, and D. And if you say, and whatever the hell else I feel like, that's not the rule of law. That's arbitrary rule. That's the rule of man. And by saying stuff like, but not limited to, you're doing exactly that. So there's a very good rule of law challenge to this. Thank you for pointing it out. Sebastian.
Mark, you did refer to the obstinate grip of South African exceptions and the belief that it's quite prevalent, which strikes me quite a bit that of certain parallels with alcoholics who don't believe that they have an issue and they are in denial of it. How easy or difficult would you say would it be to push the message or to get a broader audience to understand that perhaps actually South Africa is not that exceptional, that perhaps it trails what a lot of other African countries have done, that the governing party has acquired power because they're good at fomenting revolutions, but when things become not so good, when somebody has to keep the lights on and prevent children from dying in pit latrines, then a certain level of skill comes that is not necessarily present. And typically the regime then realizes its own inadequacies and becomes more authoritarian. That's when it starts hurting people and taking their stuff. How difficult or easy would you say would be to get a broader audience to understand that no, this is not an exception, and essentially you have a classical scenario of liberators turning tyrants, and much as you had the need to be liberated from colonialism, now you have a need to be liberated from the liberators.
So, a couple of things on, I suppose, the art of persuasion. I think a lot of nations feel that they have a unique, special story to tell. They're like a bunch of millennial children that have been told, you're just a wonderful little snowflake. The Americans think that they have a unique, special story to tell, and they're sort of having their own interesting constitutional crises. Going, well, there was a gentlemanly way of behaving when you were the president, until suddenly your president's not a gentleman anymore, and he can do what he likes. So it's important to recognize that institutions matter, that those institutional structures which have been built up for generations play an important role. I think what's difficult is that it's hard to persuade people with stats. So I've done a little bit of that tonight. I've given you some ideas of numbers. I think what you need are good stories to tell. And I think that's why I try and pep my anecdotes with a range of different responses. So, if you can visualize what it's like to be, standing in an hours-long queue at the supermarket so that you can get your toilet paper or you can get your fuel, that gives you a vivid idea of what you can face, right? I also have a motto that's worth living by, which is no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse. Okay? We have this awful optimism built into us that we say, well, it's gotten so bad, it has to get better. No, it doesn't. It can get terrible. Other countries have shown us how bad things can get. Things were really terrible in Zim a couple of months ago, and they've just gotten worse. They cut their internet off, people are being shot. In Venezuela, as I said, the inflation rate went from astoundingly terrible to absolutely, utterly terrible. Things can get worse, so don't get complacent. Yes?
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for the presentation. As a DA Member of Parliament, we may disagree on whether we've been currying in the corner or not. I think that DA stands up for constitutionalism is not a headline. Terror stands up and attacks his ex-colleagues is a headline, so your left-leaning press may tend to focus more on that. But just a couple of things I want to bring out now. Specifically, I think I want to add two strings to your bow in terms of the fighting them on the beaches and the air, etc., etc. So the two issues, and I really want to put out a call to action here. The one is to write in your comments on expropriation bill that has been put forward for public comment. Ladies and gents, it's important that we get as many comments in on that as we got in on the constitutional amendment. And the reason is that the ANC is aware, and you've mentioned the text of the constitutional amendment. The ANC is aware that they're not going to necessarily get the backing of the EFF on the wording. So that's where they possibly stand to lose their 66%. In order, however, to deliver on their the mandate from their Congress, they're going to need to bring the bill through, which is why it's been introduced. It's been introduced kind of in a hurry. And what they've done is they've taken the previous expropriation bill, made a few tiny little amendments, including that section 12.3 that you put up for us, which specifically brings in expropriation without compensation. This is to deliver on their mandate that the people gave them. So remember, for a bill, they only need a 50% majority instead of the 66. So they can effectively push that through right now as it stands with their membership. So the issue is, folks, please put your ideas forward in writing. It's important. There's a lot of holes in that bill. And a couple of things that I want to mention as well is that, first of all, property is not limited to land. It says so in Section 25 of the Constitution. And then in this expropriation bill, it refers to intangible and movable property as well. So that includes your ideas for apps, your intellectual property. It includes your bank account that you were talking about keeping as well, okay? And it includes your cattle and your cars, etc., etc. So any property can be expropriated in terms of the Constitution as it stands right now, but now without compensation, which is the worrying bit. So, folks, please get your submissions in on this draft bill, because it's scary and it looks like it's something that is going to get pushed. The other thing that I want to push is the education point of view. Getting out and speaking, and as you said, writing about it. Now something that not many people have read is the high-level panel report that was put together by Kgalema Motlanthe and team, okay? And effectively it's an ANC document. I mean, Kgalema Motlanthe is the ex-ANC president. On page 50 of the executive summary of this, I'm not going to bore you by reading it, but I urge you all to go and Google it, go and get a copy and read, if nothing else, page 50 of this, where it says all of the things that you've mentioned. It talks about the corruption amongst the staff within the department that is impeding land reform. It talks about the fact that the need to pay expropriation is not the biggest hindrance, etc., etc. If you can get that message out to people through whatever means you can, like you say, write, talk, phone into the radio, etc., etc., get those messages out. The ANC is not even united on this thing. Last 2 points, if I may. Number one, you mentioned that of the various items that are up there in front of us, CD and E were less worrisome. The problem I have is that land that has been abandoned has not been defined at all, anywhere. So abandoned land in terms of the bill is a big problem, certainly for us, because, you know, if I go on holiday, have I abandoned my land is the one question. It might be technical, but I mean, you know, as you say, trust the state, go for it, okay? The other one is the issue around state-owned property. And this is a massive concern because of the fact that there are large game reserves, there are large protected areas. There's also large pieces of land owned by certain departments, such as the Department of Defense, okay, that have a massive value. You have places like Eskom, who have taken out bonds or loans from other countries, okay? And those other countries have in the past shown a tendency to be willing to accept, when you can't pay, to accept tracts of land. And this movement of land in terms of that is something that we're very concerned about as well. So it's something I just want to highlight and throw it out there. This is an exchange of ideas. But yeah, thank you for the presentation. I've certainly taken a lot out of it, and I'll take it further up as well. Thank you, Mark.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, no, I do appreciate the technical comments. I think it is well worth, the way to read legislation is skeptically, to think what's the worst case scenario. So as I say, the common law understanding of abandoned land is quite strenuous, but you could have it defined in the bill in a less strenuous way. You definitely don't want your house being taken over while you're on vacation. I will say this, in its current form, this section is unconstitutional. It's clearly allows for compensation to be withheld in cases where the current constitution says you've got to pay. So if this thing were passed under a current constitutional regime, it wouldn't pass constitutional muster. Which also means that if that's the current state of affairs, and if you look at the beginning of this bill, it starts off by saying, acting in terms of Section 25 of the Constitution, in other words, they recognize that is the prevailing law, well then it should be fought tooth and nail now. And I hope the DA is doing a good job of fighting that, and everyone here should be doing a job in writing in submissions or funding those organizations that do. So, the last slide that I have in my presentation is all those organizations who've played a role in fighting for our rights. They don't just do it for free. So there's a lot to be said for expropriating some of your personal property and handing it over without compensation to these guys. Yes, some more questions. In the back, that's been there for a while.
Thanks very much. There seems to be many options in terms of the path to the finality of this whole process. Could you perhaps set out what those steps could be? Because you're saying the expropriation bill could go to a constitutional challenge. The wording could go to a constitutional challenge. And what I'm looking at is, what is the likely timeline on this? How long is a piece of string, probably? But if one starts to look at the impact of this whole exercise in terms of investment and development and property, particularly in South Africa, it could have long-term serious consequences. If one can get a feel, is it going to be a 1-year, a 20-year issue? I think it's important to understand that.
Yeah, as you point out, if you're an investor who's got some excess bucks and you're thinking, well, I could put it in a country in Eastern Europe where there's going to be the promise of growth of my capital, a place like Poland, or I can put it in South Africa where they very well may take the land that I invested in. I wonder what I'm going to do. So you just have a whole bunch of institutions that are just not investing. They're sitting with cash in the bank, waiting for an outcome. And so all that investor uncertainty is highly detrimental. It would be very useful if we could resolve this issue quickly. Ramaphosa, by the way, who I'm sure at least some of you in the room think he's a good guy. He's got our interests at heart. He's the businessman fighting the good fight against the evil thugs in his own party. Well, just remind yourself of a few things. One of the first things President Ramaphosa said when he was elected president of the ANC was, we are going to expropriate without compensation. And he has said it over and over and over again. I take this crazy view, which Gareth Monson shares, which is when politicians say things, I believe them. No, it's laughable. So we've got someone who seems hell-bent on doing this with utter disregard for the effect it's going to have on the economy and with no sense of timescale. So as you say, are we looking at 6 months? Are we looking at 20 years? We don't know. Probably because there's internal divisions in the party. So for example, that declaration from the Constitutional Review Committee says, we're going to do this before the next elections. And then a few days later they said, we don't think we can pull that off. So who knows? If they get roundly defeated in this set of elections, which if the DA were doing a better job in the polls, which they're not, they're sitting at 18%, looks like for the first time ever they're going to lose votes. I wish you guys were doing better. I wish you could fight this issue. Tony Leon said, if he was still leader of the party, there would be a billboard hanging from every bridge that says expropriation without compensation over my dead body. Okay. Can any of you guys think of a DA billboard that says that? I hope they come out in the next election, because really, there are some liberals in your party who care about these values, and there are people who don't. Yes, you have an response.
Mark, you raised the legalistic counters that could be raised to expropriation, which, as you also said, is theft.
Stand up, please.
So,
Stand up.
but the problem is that if this ANC regime decides to play by Africa rules, they'll just do exactly the same as Zimbabwe did, and either suspend the constitution or ignore it. And certainly the police and the military are not going to come to the rescue of the balance of the population.
Yeah, that's a concern. I will say this, which is that astoundingly so, the state still largely complies with court orders and still takes the rule of law seriously to an extent. There's a point in time where that may no longer happen. And as you say, that's when you have serious problems, because then you have a police force and an army that's not going to protect its citizens, but will protect those that are in power, right? And whoever they favor, as we've seen in Zim and Venezuela. I don't think we're there yet, but it's always worth bearing that worst scenario in mind. Yes?
So, I was thinking, you mentioned that, in, I think it was in the Northern Cape, that there were farms that were expropriated, land was taken, and then there was just a small portion of those farms that remained effective. What was that number again?
It's Eastern Cape, and it's 26 farms out of 264.
Okay, so Eastern Cape, and it's a small number. What happened to those people? Because it feels like this constitution is a forgery. It forges exiles, and not only exiles in terms of people, but in terms of their stuff. Because what happens to the agricultural equipment, for instance? What happens to the money? Where does it go? Does it go to the cloud in heaven and play a harp? Like what happens? And that's something I'm wondering about, because it's not only as far as it goes, it's not only like, oh, will this happen in 20 years? It's what will the depth of the effect be within a year, within 2 years? How deep will it go? Because with our very, I want to say, interesting African rhetoric that we have over here, I think things go, it's quite fast paced and things get pushed under the rug very quickly. So I want to ask you, do you know what would happen? Like how far such an exile, sorry for phrasing it like that, but that's the only word I can think of. How deep and how far do you think something like that would go? Would it be Zimbabwe? Would it be Venezuela? Would it be a mix? Would it be communist Russia or North Korea?
As you say, the slide can happen very quickly. Socialists have only been in power in Zim for 20 years, and they have done an astoundingly quick job. It's the one thing socialists are good at doing quickly, is ruining an economy. They're not good at doing much else quickly. So yeah, things could go south quickly. As you point out, when you have 90% of your farms failing, what happens to the guys who are working on those farms? Well, they're unemployed, right? Yeah. So let's say just for a moment you say, you know what, those farmers, bunch of landlords, capitalist pigs, I don't care about them. But if you care about the poor peasants who are working that land and had been for generations, well, they're not unemployed. And probably unemployable, because the agricultural sector is being hit very hard.
It just feels logically inconsistent if you see the polls saying that most people are worried about, unemployment or jobs, and at the same time you have a bunch of people worried about having the land back, but then you have more people who are unemployed. It's just so much ambiguity. It's this, but not limited to. This could go anywhere. This could give us
Yeah, as you say, it's it's astounding how the state can pay such poor attention to priorities and how they can manufacture false priorities. This is the survey that you were talking about earlier, and you can see, land distribution is right at the bottom, 0.6%. People don't care about this thing. They really care about unemployment. South Africa has an unemployment crisis. You've got like 27% of people are unemployed. If you had a growing economy, if you had encouragement for small businesses or for large businesses to hire people, if you had more flexible labor policies, you probably have a lot less social unrest too. We've got to remember that the social issues we have are very much tied to the economic issues. South Africa has 1,000 service delivery protests every year. It's 3 a day. Okay, you can see service delivery is the next big thing there at a third of people. If those guys were earning decent wages, that would make an enormous difference. If the state was doing the things that it's supposed to be doing, we wouldn't have these problems. Yes?
Mark, you'll recall a couple of years ago, there was a Concord decision relating to the deprivation of an owner of mineral rights, of those mineral rights. And that was held not to be expropriation, simply because the state deprived the owner of the mineral rights and took them into custody, but did not pass them on to a new owner. That would be the complete process of expropriation. And because it was not technically expropriation, the Court, and I think the Chief Justice wrote that judgment, held that no compensation had to be paid. Is there a danger that the state could adopt the same methodology with regard to land broadly as they did with mineral rights, or is there no danger? Would you enlighten us?
Sure. So I'll say this, which is that the state saw that judgment and leapt for joy and said, this custodianship, this sounds very nice. Mogoeng's reasoning in that judgment was that minerals are a special thing. They have a unique history in South Africa, that you've had people working on mines for generations. There's something symbolic about these minerals trapped inside Mother Earth, and on that basis kind of created this little sub-caveat for minerals. He then went into quite a lot of detail explaining why it was a special case and wouldn't apply to all sorts of other property. But the state produced something called the Promotion and Protection of Investment Act. It's, you'll notice that authoritarians are very good at covering their authoritarian measures with beautiful language, promoting and protecting investments. The plan was to do exactly that to everything, which was to say all property, and there was a long list, could be taken as custodianship, under custodianship, which means no obligation to pay compensation. I, at the time, wrote a number of articles on it, did some lobbying on it, and I was at a SIA conference with a representative of the Minister for the Department of Trade and Industry that were pushing the bill forward. And at it, they withdrew at the conference. They said, you know what, we've realized that judgment doesn't enable us to do what we think it does, and we're removing it, and they did. So it seems, at least for now, that fight has been fought and won. Yes?
I would have thought that the reason for paying compensation is for the deprivation. You're replacing cash as an asset in someone's balance sheet with mineral rights in that case. Whether the mineral rights are held, or the land are held in custody or actually passed on to somebody else is immaterial. I think philosophically that judgment is suspect.
Yeah, so in other countries they refer to constructive expropriation, which is, in other words, where the state takes something but doesn't go and hand it on to someone else, and they probably would have considered that an act of constructive expropriation and would have required payment. It's, the difficulty with the Constitutional Court is, being the highest court in the land, it can decide what the law is. Yes?
I'm just curious.
Yeah, go for it.
No, I'm just curious of what's the end goal of the entire expropriation without compensation plan, because as you mentioned, 95% of the land claims between 1945 and 2014 has been dealt with, A, and B, most of them wanted cash instead of land itself. So I'm just wondering, what are they trying to do? Where do they want to end up? Because I assume they don't want to create Zimbabwe 2 Revenge of Marxism or something. Where do they want to end up at the end of the day?
Well, if you listen to the EFF, they have a different idea in mind to the ANC officially, which is that no one should be a private owner of land, that everything should be owned by the state, that individuals should have leasehold over land, which is reviewable every 25 years. So that is the official EFF manifesto on it. So in other words, if you currently vote EFF and you think the EFF is going to give you land, well, read their manifesto. They're going to take it from you, and maybe if you behave, they'll let you lease it from them. So yeah, that's the Marxism, 5.7, because it's been tried so many times and failed every single time.
No,
still appears to be on the cards.
Marxism, you see. That wasn't real Marxism. Yes. We'll do it right. They'll do it. The EFF will do it right.
Yes.
They'll do it properly this time. You just have to believe in the state, as
exactly.
you said.
There's a question at the back.
Yes, I'm so sorry. So unfortunately, I missed most of your presentation. But from what I
You're going to fail the pop quiz afterwards.
Sorry. So I'm definitely going to look out for it on the channels that you mentioned. What I would like to know, is that just today, and it's actually a historical thing the world over, is that the percentage of young people who actually go out and vote. so are very, very, very low. So those between the age so of 18 to 30 is actually the least likely to vote. But at the same time, so we sit with a problem. So for them, they're not as politically loyal to a specific political party, so as their parents or older generations would do. So for them, very similar to the table that you've got out there, for them land is very much, so at lower scale compared to things like unemployment and some education, etc. So what difference would it make if there's a greater mobilization of actually get younger people to take part in this process? So in order to get them mobilized, in order to provide a counterweight to what the politicians are trying to do. Because obviously they are the ones that are going to pay the consequences in the future, even more than we are. So it's their futures that are at stake. So to what extent are they actually informed about what is going on in these things?
Well, you raise an excellent issue, which is that we've got a very young population in South Africa who I think are quite disheartened. The unemployment rate among the youth is much higher than among the general population. They're easy prey for radical organizations like the EFF, who've done an excellent job of mobilizing them, because they say, hey guys, you don't have a job, would you like some free t-shirts and some KFC and come to this rally with us, and let's take back the land. And that sounds wonderful. And I do think it's important that organizations that understand the importance of property rights and how much that matters for the youth, that they reach out to them. There are a couple of excellent youngsters who are doing that, and speaking the language of the youth, and engaging on Twitter, and starting podcasts and video series and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's an important thing. I think the DA probably feels this difficult tension with those in the DA youth, is that there probably are a lot more radical people in the DA. I mean, from people I speak to there, some members of the DA think expropriating the compensation is a great idea in the youth. And the party is obviously not conveying the liberal ideas properly to its own members. So yeah, I think political parties have a role to play in convincing people and the youth that this is an important thing worth fighting, and getting them together to join us in this fight is vital for all of us. Question over there.
Yeah, just coming back to this gentleman's statement here regarding the EFF's policies. So suppose they get their way and the government is now going to take all of the land. How exactly does it work with things like the Ingwenyama Trust? Like, I mean, when you go down to, and of course if you're going to go to Zululand and tell the Zulu king, well, we're going to come and take over the show here, well, then how are the Xhosas going to feel about that? And then you have to ask, what about the Sotho and Tswana, and who's from this sort of area region? I mean, why then? It seems like you're preferring one tribal community over another, and in South Africa this notion of these communities is a very significant part of our discourse in preserving their cultures and these things. I'm just thinking what you might, how does that catch up?
Yeah, so I think the ANC has kind of equivocated on this issue. On the one hand, this idea that we're going to expropriate whatever land we need to. The Zulus have made it very clear that if you touch land in the Nyongwa Trust, that they've got their battle gear ready. Now, what's interesting as well is that you have this, some would say, unlikely alliance between AfriForum and the Zulu King, saying that property rights matter and we're going to protect this. So you're right, and you do open up another can of worms, an ethnic can of worms, by saying, well, fine, we'll have a Zulu exemption. How's that going to go down? Part of, if you look at our equality clause, we don't discriminate on the grounds of ethnicity or race. So you can't prioritize one group over another. So yeah, there's a very dangerous can of worms there that ought not to be knocked over. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. My question is more just a basic question of clarification. The reason why I'm asking this basic clarification question is the thing is that I've encountered many people, and the thing is, people don't know what actually is going on. It's like, no, it's in the news, no, amendment section 25, no, it's going to go through, and the result is just hysteria, and just, I wouldn't say mass hysteria, not at this point, but hysteria, and then people start doing, and saying very irresponsible things that can just make the situation way worse. So the thing is, people don't know what's going on and they're not informed. So I just want to ask a basic clarification on where are we now with the expropriation bill. I know you mentioned in your talk it's not passed yet and stuff, but like what the nature of it is, how how it could be passed, and also you mentioned the force field. I believe you mentioned it was section 36 or something. Just elaborate more on that, just to have a basic like clarification so that we can just communicate to people and just prevent unnecessary hysteria, please. Thank you.
Sure. I'm not convinced that the hysteria is unnecessary. I'm concerned about complacency. I think we are far enough down the road on this thing where we should be very concerned. And I am not a fearmonger. I think you've got to be reasonable, you've got to look at the evidence, you've got to weigh things up, you've got to act reasonably. And what we have is a proclamation from Parliament saying we're going to change the Bill of Rights. That's time to be alarmed. When it comes to how long, we don't know. We have a limbo. As I say, we have a sense that the aim is to try and do it before the elections. It's unlikely that they'll be able to get it done before then, but I'm sure there'll be some mad scrambling. It's also no coincidence that the expropriation bill is to be, the call for public comments is, during December and now. When people are still kind of, getting back from their holidays, they're disorientated. It's a very clever way to push things through, when your populace isn't looking. So that's why, I am thankful for you saying earlier that the public ought to play an important role in combating the expropriation bill and pointing out how pernicious and unconstitutional it is. There will also be another process, which is that once we get this bill, which is to amend the Bill of Rights, there'll be another public comment on that, and more room for engagement, and people need to do that, and they need to do that in a reasonable manner. So look, when you say hysteria, I mean, you don't want people sort of, running through the streets with their, arms in the air going, what are we going to do? You want them thinking about what to do, taking decisive action, having a game plan, knowing how to do that. And that's what I've tried to say, is that you want a good battle strategy, because we are engaged in the battle here. Part of it's the battle of ideas, part of it's a battle at the polls. Don't get me wrong, I know I've said a lot of mean things about the DA tonight, but I hope your guys' numbers go up. They're one of the parties that do care about liberal values sometimes. Yeah, go for it.
One important aspect of this which we haven't discussed tonight is third-party interests, in particular mortgages and bank mortgages. I have my farm mortgaged to Standard Bank. What happens with Standard Bank?
Yeah, this is an amazing thing to me. So I went to an event at Norton Rose, in Sandton. You're at literally the epicenter of white monopoly capital, right? And they've got this conference on expropriation without compensation, and they have bosses there and business leadership South Africa there, and all of them say, we support expropriation without compensation. It's astounding to me that business people are so out of kilter with what's right and what's against their own interests. So the banks have sort of said, it's a bit of a problem for us because we have a lot of mortgages on farmland, and if that land was taken, we wouldn't have security anymore, and I guess that would have repercussions for the rest of the economy. So maybe you shouldn't do it, but also the guilt and the associations with the past, and I guess is all we can do, and we haven't really thought about this properly.
But the state would surely have to compensate the bank.
There's an argument for it.
At least they go so far as to say we're not compensating the bank too, which would double the trouble.
Yes. So if you're compensating the bank, what's the point? In other words, if you've got a piece of land that you've borrowed 100 million rand for this farm, and you owe it to the bank, and the state says we're taking your land and I have to pay the bank, well, they're not better off. They haven't done much with their expropriation without compensation. It's also, if they, as an individual owner, you might think, well, if they're going to take it from me, I certainly better not be the one who pays for it. So let me borrow the money. And I'm sure the banks are wise enough there too, and won't be very keen to lend people money on land.
So the best advice to a farmer or landowner is get mortgaged quickly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah.
Yes, I'm standing up with two motives. One is I think we need to bring it to a close, but then I do have two comments on which I'd like you to respond. And I prefix them with saying that I'm possibly an odd one out. I don't think that white-owned land of rich white people is significantly at risk. And frankly, if I were on the board of a bank, I wouldn't bother much. And I want to point out that the first announcement of an expropriation without compensation, I think in South Africa, as far as I know, was the shanty town called Marathon and Delport in Kuruleng, Germiston. Now this is very peculiar, not some property in Bryanston, not a rich farmer from Tonda's farm, not some speculative land held somewhere, but a shanty town. And they have an eviction order for all of the people there. It's a technically illegal township, informal settlements are, and they've announced they want to expropriate it for housing development, whatever that means. So, 40,000 impoverished, destitute black South Africans are going to be the first victims of expropriation without compensation, not some rich white person. And the reason I don't think white people have to worry very much is because if they try and take some rich white person's farm in Bryanston, house in Bryanston, they're going to face litigation. How many cases can they handle? The real victims will be poor people, because they will be essentially defenseless. And this is what I understand the law to be. The DA asked in Parliament, what will the expropriating authority be? Well, the answer to that is thousands of petty government officials in every government department and agency at every level of government has the power to expropriate. And they expropriate to build a cemetery or extend a road or make a park or put a ISCOM transformer or whatever, police stations, schools, clinics, hospitals. And whose land are they going to take? When they want to build a community centre in Alex, they will just give an eviction order to 20, 30, 40 people. So I'm of the view that the real illusion that's taking place here is somehow that white people are the primary people at risk. I think this is a completely mistaken conception. It's low-income people, most of them are black, who will be overwhelmingly the victims, and Cyril Ramaphosa will be nowhere near an actual expropriation. It will be the parks manager of Pofadder that expropriates. And whose land will they expropriate? The land of the person who's going to put up the least resistance. Starting with one of the biggest and poorest shanty towns in South Africa, Marathon and Delport, whose representative stood where you are now a week ago and explained why they oppose expropriation without compensation. You'd think poor black people would support it because they would somehow expect to be a beneficiary. The reality is they suddenly realize they will actually be the first and by far the biggest victims. So I just want you to address this mindset which people on both sides have. Unfortunately, most of the organizations you listed there see this in this racial thing. Somehow this is against whites, for black people, and everyone on both sides is seeing that. And I just think this is a giant illusion and a huge mistake that is not actually going to manifest itself. And when the president says it will not be done in a way that harms food security, he does not himself know who actually expropriates, which is the parks manager or the cemetery manager of a little village in the middle of nowhere. Those are the people who in fact expropriate, and they will be the ones with this power.
I concur entirely. So you're right that it'll be the poor and vulnerable and often black who will be the most abused, and those without access to wealthy lawyers in Sandton. To add one further thing, which is people forget that we live in a multi-party democracy, that the ANC doesn't govern the whole country, that the DA, for example, govern a bunch of metros, okay, and that they would also have expropriating powers. One of the places that they do govern is Johannesburg, where the Tuli House is. So it's not clear to me that as the ANC, you want to give this weapon to those across the aisle from you, to say, feel free to bludgeon us to death with it. Also, the electoral landscape may change. And once you've changed the constitution, it doesn't matter, as you say, what Cyril Ramaphosa intends on doing. What about his successors in title? Didi Mabuza is going to be next in line to wield this hammer ever he sees fit. So when crafting a legislative weapon, those in government must always recognize that it is a weapon that sits on the table and can be used by their enemies at a moment's notice. Thank you very much, guys.